Hi, we reach the end of Genesis 17 today with Abraham's ritual-like execution of the commands of God to fulfill this covenant. And as we'll see, it's parallel to a similar situation where Abraham carries out the terms of an agreement with the Hittites in chapter 23 to obtain a burial place for Sarah, which will become a burial place for him and the immediate descendants as well. And I want to look at those together to see how the narrators have put in a legal-like summary here to show how specifically Abraham has carried out both the covenant here and the contract in chapter 23 as an expression both of obedience and of the fulfillment of his part of the obligation to expect that in this case Yahweh would fulfill, or Elohim would fulfill their part, and in chapter 23 the Hittites will fulfill their part. So as we look at this, we're continuing to explore these chiastic and parallel structures that we've seen, and here it reaches an immediate conclusion where that certainly is connected with Abraham's age being mentioned at 99 years. And then at the end of this, we saw the first half here, we saw the sign of the oath commanded, and here we see the sign of it fulfilled. So even though there's some details in these elements that don't quite fit, we can certainly see how the beginning matches the end, and the inner parts are parallel that way. But it's also, as Williamson has been pointing out, just a call and response, and here's the end of that as well. So we've also been looking at the key words, and now we're on this final paragraph, and we see that there aren't really new words here, and that's going to be really important. All the words we hear here, we've heard up here. You can see every male up here, and flesh of your foreskins, circumcised in here, which is to say that's exactly the point, that God has finished speaking, and now it's just up to Abraham to carry it out. So as we do that, let's look at the parallel endings, as I mentioned here, so we can see something that's going on here. So in chapter 23, God, in whatever name, has nothing to do with the story at all. It's simply what we would call a secular arrangement to buy a piece of land. And it's also a matter of the first fulfillment of what we saw earlier in this chapter, of the promise of the land of Canaan. And so we see it's mentioned the land of Canaan. We'll, of course, get into that in detail when we get there. But notice this structure of the way they're similar, not only in terms of the kind of language, a sort of ritual language, but there's a repetition at the beginning and the end of the details. And then in the middle is something that Abraham does. So here, or is told. So here we're told how old they were, and here that he actually buried his wife. But notice that they're very similar in this kind of structure, highlighting the repetition that in case any of you didn't get it, he fulfilled it in detail. And we can see that here too, because here were the commands from God, and here are the fulfillments explicitly repeated twice. And so the narrator uses God's exact language here to show that Abraham is carrying out exactly as required. So let's look back at our keywords and go through our story here, and we can see another way that the writers have arranged this in a ritualistic form, which is the chiasm that shapes this exact part. As I was just saying, the chiasm for the whole chapter is questionable, and there are a number of little chiasms. We've seen ABA, and we saw a chiasm in 9 to 14, but here's one very clearly here, and the B parts are particularly important because they use the term that very day, which is a very special term here, etsem, a word that can mean bone, but it also means that very day, and it's used in these two places, here, and only a couple of other places, and the other places it's used are as bone. Only 7:13 is it used in the same way here on that very day, which is Noah and his family entering the ark, again expressing a carrying out of the command of God. So it's parallel. The use of that very day is parallel here to 7:13, but the ritual shape, as we saw, is parallel to chapter 23. So we get to verse 24, and we get to the act. Abraham was 99 years old when he was circumcised in the flesh of his foreskin. And notice it's passive voice here, and it's passive voice here too, and it's passive voice here too. And if we go down to here, it's passive voice here too. But who's doing all this circumcising? And what would be the message? Just as we dealt in chapter 12 with the question of what was Sarai's response to Abram saying, I heard a voice and we're going, and we don't get to hear her response. Here we don't get to hear from Ishmael or however many other men there are in the house, plural slaves born in the house, and apparently some bought with money from a foreigner, not to mention the others in the house like Hagar, and we don't know who else. So we don't know how many of these are, but since Abraham's the only one who heard the command, I can't imagine anybody else carrying it out. So 99-year-old Abraham is circumcising himself. That's kind of hard to imagine given the technology of the day. And earlier video, I posted a YouTube link to a modern surgical circumcision of an adult, which is obviously a procedure done with anesthetic and surgical instruments, etc. And it was not in those days. Even though we may be in something like the Iron Age, certainly the time of the authors is that, but what kind of tools can we imagine they had in the second millennium BCE to carry this out? Stone knives, maybe? Bronze knives? Doing it to yourself is something the text doesn't deal with, but we are invited to think about that. And what was Ishmael's response? 13-year-old Ishmael, who his father comes up and says, I have something to do, take off your clothes. Yet we don't hear anything of the men of the house or the slaves. Certainly anybody who's defined as slaves, although we notice that the word slave is not in there. We saw earlier it simply means son of the house. And it certainly implies people who are out of the part of the Bayit Ab, the father's house, in this case Ab for Abraham's house in particular. But it's really something that we don't hear any of the responses. And that's important in another way, because in chapter 34, another group of men are going to be circumcised, not the Israelites, but their opponents, and we'll see that they're disabled for several days, enough that two of Jacob's sons can go and destroy them. Slaughter them all while they're recovering. So certainly at the time, circumcision was a procedure that involved substantial pain and substantial healing time. We don't know how long it would have been in chapter 34, because however long it was not enough, because the two men can simply overwhelm them, disabled as they are from the procedure. They are all circumcised now. Does that make them Jews? Of course not. None of these people are anything called Jews. It doesn't make them Israelites either. But it does make them part of the covenant, except Ishmael. And that's an interesting question, isn't it? Because all the others are considered part of the covenant, but only Ishmael is excluded, even though he's promised a blessing and great fruitfulness, and will become a great nation as well. So it's only those who are going to stay in the house. And of course, we'll see in chapter 21 that under Sarah's influence, Ishmael and Hagar will be kicked out. And it'll be God again who takes care of them. So with this, a new situation is established. There is this covenant, and now it's a matter of God carrying out God's part, the promise that there will be a child next year. And we'll see that in chapter 18. See you for that next time. Bye-bye.